Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, but not as always is this actually a couple of nukes, nuke power, as we like to say when we PT. It is a couple of nukes. I've got another nuclear operator here, and he didn't get the memo to wear the mock turtleneck sweater, which I only do when I record with other nukes because I don't know who in the military one day said we need to add mock turtlenecks to the uniform because you wear it with the camouflage and then you just have doesn't make sense, but it's about 565 ranking when I'm wearing this for those who want to do the conversion. But yeah, we're here. We're gonna get into a lot of stuff. We're gonna get into some nuke power, as in the nuclear community in the Navy, talk about some of the mental health stuff, the military lifestyle, get into some submarine stuff, which I love talking submarines. I almost went on a submarine, just as people will tell me they almost enlisted, I say I almost went on a submarine. And so, yeah, we're here with someone who did actually go on a submarine, and Mr. William Spears, great to have you here. We're going to get into a lot, and I'd love for you to just give a brief overview about yourself as we begin here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Whiskey. But first, do they really say nuke power when you PT now? Is that a thing?
So, so some people will, right? What happens is you get to nuke school, and like the first day of PT, you've got a chief in charge, and he reads all the things you're supposed to say. And then one of
Yeah.
you gets picked to be in charge, and you don't say that again. But we would say, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm gonna say this. When you would swap side, if you were doing an exercise in one direction and then you had to go in the other direction, you would say like, "Who ya rudder switch swoosh." Like you had to say the stupidest stuff, like PT. But I remember.
Good grief. What is the world coming to, man?
Yeah, it was be like we always had some kind of stupid
Yeah.
saying going on. Like every time our RDC and boot camp would make us do something, we'd say, "But petty officer, killers need sleep too," and stuff like that. And yeah, we had our nuclear gang signs that we would do at
Yeah.
each other and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Right hand rule, man. All
Yeah, we
right.
used to do like a gang sign, and I gotta say, I real quick ask you to introduce yourself, and here I am on a tangent, but the nuke power thing became like a no one wanted to say it, right? Because whenever you try to like do some kind of cool morale thing, most people hate it, and especially because people found nuke power very corny, and I won't. I kind of thought it was funny. It used to be kind of like the motto of the show for a while, and we were in the hangar bay for an all hands call. And each division would like cheer and shout something, like aviation guys would go screaming when the captain called in their division. And reactor all agreed when the captain calls on us, not a word will be said. We want everyone to know that we are overworked, we are tired, we are underpaid, and we hate our lives. Nuke life is not it. And the captain calls on us. He goes, reactor. And the whole hangar bay is just silent. And so, of course, I scream at the top of my lungs, nuke power! And it just echoes throughout the whole hangar bay. And everyone turns and looks at me like, you gotta be kidding me. But I couldn't help myself. I love it. You know what? I don't care. People. There's so many things in the military that
You
people
broke ranks, man.
get. Yeah. People just like we were standing at ease.
Yeah.
People get so I don't know. People are just like too there's a lot of ego going on in the military. There's a lot of like I don't know. You look at the amount of sailors who don't do Mando fun events or don't take advantage of the MWR because of their masculinity, and it's just really dumb. We'll get into that conversation, but Mr. Spears, please, who
All
are
right.
you?
Well, before we get too far down track, first thing I need to say is I'm just here as Will Spears. Like I am not speaking on behalf of the Navy. All opinions here are my own, even though I am actively serving. Anything I say doesn't constitute endorsement of a service or a hyperlink or anything like that. If I say Nickelback sucks, it's my opinion, even though it's a scientifically proven fact. Anyway. So I am a active duty commander in the submarine force. I am after my EXO tour, I hope to be a CO someday, but like right now I'm on shore duty after EXO. I'm prior enlisted. So I enlisted in the Navy right after graduating high school before September 11th in 2001. It was in June of 2001. So I was actually in A school whenever the September
Wow.
11th attacks occurred, which was a very formative time. It was interesting. And I've kind of lived by the rule of just apply for everything. And anytime the Navy offers to send me to school, I take it. And so I've been to a lot of school. But coming back to, I was a nuke electrician like you when I went through and basically finished prototype and then went to the academy after that. Went and did engineering from there and came back into nuclear power. Went submarine force, did a JO tour and a fast attack out of Guam, and did a WEPS tour on a fast attack out of Hawaii, and then EXO on a SSBN out of Washington. That's basically been my career. I also do a lot of writing on the side. And so I'm in the process of publishing a book right now on Stoicism that's basically for a military audience, but it's a pretty academic kind of investigation. It's a deep dive into Stoicism and how it applies to military service. Book's called Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy.
Yeah, so when you say you were enlisted first, in military terms, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that he's one of the good ones. He's one of the good guys. And
Oh, it doesn't mean that. I'm totally the
yeah.
enemy.
Yeah. And speaking of schooling, you mentioned a lot of schooling. I am an alumni, a DD 214 alumni.
Yeah.
And what that means is everything I say, I got to give my disclaimer, is bitter and salty and not always positive. And you reminded me of opportunities, right? There are a lot of opportunities for education in the military. And I remember they had mentioned like Stay 21 and other opportunities to go to college and go officer side, nuclear officer. And I just, I was never like, no, no, no. And then prototype, I was like, you know what? I do want to, because I wanted to do 20, when I was in prototype, I wanted to do 20 years. Most people who listen to the show know why I chose not to do 20 years. And it was actually because of prototype stuff that happened. But at that time I was like super Hooyah Navy spirit, like let's do this nuke power. And when I went to the admin guy in the window, I was like, hey, I know I missed there was like a meeting a week ago on like State 21 and stuff, and I happened to be on leave. I went home and surprised my sister for her birthday. I'd really like to get that paperwork and caught up on stuff. I'd really like to apply. And there was plenty of time to do so. And the guy at the window was just like, well, why didn't you do it in A school? Why didn't you do it in power school? Why did you wait till now? And I was like, well, that's really none of your concern. There's a window right now to apply, and I want to apply. He's like, he just like gave me so much attitude for no reason. And this wasn't a nuke. This
Yeah.
was a
And
yeoman.
you just got to do it.
I
You just
know.
got
And
to,
I'm
you
like,
got to
what did,
spam
I
all
was
those
like, your
programs.
job is to give me the paperwork, not ask
Yeah.
questions. Like, uh, just give me
Yeah.
the form to
You're
fill
going to
out.
meet people like that. Like,
Yeah. That's
whatever.
everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just
That's,
wanted to share that because I've never been able to vent that out on the podcast. But yeah, and
no, yeah. Let it out, man.
trust me, I'm sure you've had your experience with
Yeah.
yeomans and admin and stuff because one time
Yeah.
I was stuck in personnel for like an hour trying to get into NSIPs, and one of the yeomans had put a little clear piece of tape over the chip on the cat card of my yeoman, and so he could not get it to work. But he didn't see the piece of tape, nor did I, because it was just this little
It's
clear
just playing a
thing.
joke on him.
Yes, but it cost me my whole afternoon and my lunch. And it
Oh,
wasn't even to prank me. Yeoman, I feel
yeah.
like personnel is always at lunch or pranking each other. Because a different time, a yeoman was like, "Where's my cat card?" And someone hands him a giant block of ice in a bucket, and his cat card's frozen in the middle of it. Because
Oh,
they
man.
filled it with water, put his cat card on top, froze it, and then filled it on water again and froze it again.
So
Now,
one of the things that I figured out once I kind of got to the XO level and you're trying to run a ship is that there are certain divisions in the ship that are there for customer service or have a huge customer service role. The yeomen are the biggest version of that, but
yeah.
also supply department or supply division or LS division, whatever you want to call them on your
Those are your
ship.
allies. They'll
Yeah.
get you stuff. If you do favors for them, they'll
Yeah.
scratch your back.
And the ITs too. You know, ITs and for certain divisions, radio or communications, anyone where you to do your job are depending on this other division to do your job. Those guys, how well they're doing their jobs of taking care of other people has a huge impact on morale on the crew. And so at the leadership level, you really got to pay attention and make sure that those guys kind of inculcate of customer service culture because if you just let it be and you got one grumpy dude that doesn't want to process people's paperwork or wants to give people crap every time he does, that'll seriously like affect a lot of
100%.
people's quality of life and dramatically, especially when you're underway and everything's kind of magnified and emotions get crazy, so that's a big, big deal. Fortunately, I had a really good experience with my yeoman. As an XO, you really depend on the yeoman a lot,
Oh yeah.
and they can totally make or break you. And I had some really good ones. So, I lucked out there.
For me as well, we were in shipyard, and so personnel and all these other offices were never there. It's like, chief will be like, "Did you get it done today?" They weren't here today. I'll check again tomorrow. You check again tomorrow, they're at lunch. You check the next day, they're at the dentist. Like it's just
Yeah,
somehow
that's unsat. Like
a
whenever
lot of
whenever
leaders
that's
would send
happening,
people
you
home
have
early
to,
in shipyard. You just go
yeah,
home. Like aviation left at 10 a.m. every day sometimes. Sometimes 12 was a long day for them. Meanwhile, you've got Nuke staying there till 2000. It
yeah,
just that shipyard freedom can kind of when that bug bites some of the divisions, it's like they're always going home. And it got to the point in some places I've seen it where division was really not pulling their weight during shipyard. And then you get out to sea and the port call gets canceled because this division failed their test because they were goofing off in shipyard. Like that happened to my friend. They were supposed to go to Hawaii. Oh, aviation was not ready at all. They failed their flight test because, and then guess what? We knew that aviation was leaving 1000 or 12 in the afternoon every day. You never saw them pass 1300. So that directly affected everyone later on. But you know what? The worst part is you can't control other divisions, right? You can barely handle stuff in your own
that's
division
right.
sometimes.
Handle what you can control. And that's where your mental health is going to be found,
Yeah.
is doing that well.
Yeah, so don't expect that hazmat office line to not be long because
Yeah.
I know at least for our ship, if we sent someone to get something from hazmat, like paint or chemicals or something, they'd be gone for like an hour, or more, just waiting in line. It's rough when people are never. I remember like one day we needed to go to the ship store to get something, or maybe it was even the barber shop, and they weren't open on time. And then they gave us attitude when they showed up late. They're like, why are you here on time so early? Relax, shipmate, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, okay, well, we're reactor and we've been working since midnight or 5 a.m. And it's like, this is the military. Like, I did get into a big beef with one of the barbers or like the next door people on the ship because it's like, this isn't like you're walking casually. Oh, I just run a shop on the ship. It's like, yes, but it's a moving part of a huge system, of a billion-dollar system, right? And everyone relies on one another. One team, one fight. As much as I hate that saying sometimes, that's also very true. And it's like all my stuff has to be done on time. And it's just ridiculous to not see other divisions be held accountable sometimes. Cause like I know, at least in reactor, like if it wasn't done on time, like there are major consequences, not just reactor side, but just like command wise and what's going to happen to you, right? You're going to get talked to at minimum. Meanwhile, these guys are just showing up to the barber shop or the other shop or whatever it is, sometimes personnel nonchalantly. It's like you've got a line of people waiting and now all their stuff is pushed back. So now their watch bill, their maintenance is pushed back. And then if
Yeah.
watch is pushed back, now someone else who was standing the watch didn't get relieved on time. Like there's a big ripple effect.
Yeah. The way you mentioned accountability, like that was a big leadership lesson for me, kind of coming up in the ranks. Cause as a JO, you think like, man, whenever I make it up to a higher rank, I don't believe in mast and, I don't want to ever punish anyone. And you
Mm,
think that that's going to be your route to high morale. And it's the opposite because you're going to have dirt bags, and
100%.
whenever there's a dirt bag, being a dirt bag and everyone can see it and they get away with it. And we say, oh, let's give them a second chance. Oh, let's give them a fifth chance. And I don't really want to do it. We don't really want to punish him. He means well. Everyone that is doing their job right gets pissed off. And ultimately, they want to live in a just world. People want to know that they can come and do their jobs, and that people who are not doing their jobs, there's going to be some kind of accountability there. And so, getting over your aversion to conflict or aversion to negativity is kind of a necessary part of growing up as a leader, is being able to get over those natural human inclinations. So as a young officer, you look at it, you think that leadership is all just social skill and being able to get along with everyone and make everyone like you. And that's not going to work for very long. And if you're not effective and things are falling apart because you're not holding people accountable or not running the schedule right, they're not going to like you either because their lives are going to suck, you know?
Yeah.
So that was a big kind of growing point for me growing up as a leader there.
I actually really appreciate that perspective because I think we do definitely judge harshly how leadership is handling things. And trust me, I've seen a lot of terrible leadership, but I really like your point of if you let people get away with stuff, you're too lenient, it does have that huge ripple effect and affect everyone. And that was the thing too that like really pissed off all the sailors and shipyard were that the shipyard workers, so many of them were always sitting around on their phone eating a sandwich, talking about disability and divorce. And it's like, we can't do our maintenance until these people work, but we can't poke them. We're not in charge of them. And
Yeah.
it's like, where are their leaders? We don't know. It's like they got their own custom bathrooms with thick toilet paper. By the way, we had the thinnest toilet paper made by blind people, like actually quite literally skillcraft made by blind. And then surface side, the shipyard workers had their own portable bathroom on the ship and they had the thick toilet paper. They had the good toilet paper.
It's
And
amazing the things that are like symbolic and will make all the difference in the world and just really piss people off if you're if you don't pay attention to it. And one of the things that I've observed kind of growing up is that generally leadership, it's very rare that someone's actually nefarious and actually evil. You know, you have your nefarious or overly lazy people, you have your bad leaders, but most people are fundamentally good. And the effects of bureaucracy are kind of a dehumanizing effect. And so, as an enlisted sailor, I'm looking at officers and these damn officers and their
yeah,
academy rings and
the bell ring.
their judgment and their haughtiness and all this thing. And then you become an officer and you're like, well, I don't want anyone to think that of me. And neither do most of the other officers. You'll have the one smug guy who ruins it for everybody. But
Mhm.
most people, you're just trying to do your job. And then as a junior officer, I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh, those senior officers, they're such jerks. You know, I'm never going to be like that. And then you get to that level and you're trying to run a ship and you're trying to keep everyone happy. And you realize that if the ship is not achieving its purpose, it's not doing its job, then life is going to suck real bad. The squadron's going to send all these people down. They're going to send a lot of help. The inspectors are going to come. You're going to fail inspections. And then you're going to get all this extra help. And it's going to be awful for everyone. And everyone's morale is going to suffer. And so you've got these tightrope to walk. And then, but I can, when I'm a senior officer on a ship and I'm looking out at the Pentagon, oh, those people in DC, they're so awful. They don't fund the thing that I think is important, the thing that I want. And now guess where I work? I work at the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And what do? I look at spreadsheets all day and I look at how expensive everything is. And I work in a part of the Pentagon, I work for civilians. I'm just one of the uniforms that's kind of sprinkled around the office. But what my office does is we cut funding to stuff that shouldn't be funded and give it to stuff that should be. And those are like really hard decisions to make. Really, what we do is we put together recommendations that go all the way up to the deputy and the secretary, and they make the decisions. But the point is that at all these levels are human beings that are doing their best with what incentives they have in front of them and what they think is their job to do. And you're going to have your occasional nefarious actor, but usually what's at fault are the dehumanizing aspects of bureaucracy and just the complexity of the organization.
I wish I heard what you said, but there was that one nefarious officer in my mind who would purposely get in your face and demand to be saluted. And so
Oh, that did not actually happen.
my former shipmate was on the fantail, the back of the aircraft carrier. That's an outdoor space, and he was actively on a phone call after working hours. And this officer walks out, and he glances over, but he's on the phone. He's looking away. Officer literally walks over, cuts between him and the railing to get in his face, and he says, "You're really not going to salute me." And my friend was so pissed, and he would always tell this story because, like, I knew the officer too, because he walked in one time and I was at a watch station and I had just sat down. Like, we literally, like, the guy I relieved was walking out and I had just sat down, and he looked at me. He's like, "Oh, sleeping on watch. I guess you want to go to mass." And I was like, "What? I just sat down. Like I don't like." And he was always like going around like when he goes, and then saying we had an MA on the ship who thought he was a Marine. Cut all his
Yeah.
hair off. Was like, stand at attention and yell the sailor's creed right now. I'm a MA. And he actually got put onto the MA mean Facebook page that my ship made of all the hoity-toity, MAs who were just over the top. So, but look,
Wow.
there was plenty
These
of
are
great
these are
ones I
some real
saluted.
winners that you've encountered. Now, were most people like that?
No, no, of course.
No,
Like I
right.
said,
So
we had
like these are
one
the
in
people
a
that
couple
stick with
left.
you,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you these people like all the other people around are seeing them and just rolling their eyes, saying like, "Oh, there he goes again. He's gonna
Every
go."
other officer I knew was like would walk away and try not to get saluted
Yeah,
because
so
we
that's
had
the
plenty of
thing. This
enlisted.
is the thing. Like, there's all these little anecdotes about the salute, and like anyone particularly desires to be saluted. Like, it's a pain, once you go from being enlisted to officer, you go from saluting about one in every four people to saluting literally everyone you pass, and it's a pain,
Well, it's the pain
And
end of
so
it.
if I'm walking up the path or something, and a guy's like looking down at something, looking away or looking at his phone or something, I'm like thinking like, please notice that I'm here and salute me so that I don't have to say anything to you. Because if I don't say anything to you and you don't salute me, I'm going to get crap from the master chief that's behind me and it says, "Hey, sir, you're really supposed to enforce the standards," or some crap
Yeah,
like I don't
yeah.
want to deal with all this. Like it's a
Hmm.
pain, like
Yeah,
I don't feel personally disrespected. I just, I don't want to deal with it.
well, and that's the thing too. You find you talk about personally disrespected. There's a lot of things that are taken personally in the military that aren't personal, obviously.
Nah, it's not just the
Um,
military, man.
and,
That's
and,
that's
and,
life.
and
That's
everywhere. Yeah,
yeah,
obviously. We could talk about workplace culture forever, but I always say, at Nuke school, when I went through, the officers' lunch was a different time than ours. And so
yeah,
when all the officers were standing in line to get back into the school building, all the enlisted would walk out and they would purposely salute the officers. Because, like, when they were all standing in line, most of the higher ups were like, it's fine, you don't have to salute them. They were like, no, they wanted to make every single officer salute. They would make sure they stopped and saluted everyone. And it would be, they'd be like, good morning, sir. Like super obnoxious about it. And
yeah.
we had one guy who had read through the rule book and found out that you could say aloha as a salute because it was like allowed in Hawaii bases. So we'd be like, aloha, sir. And it'd be like 1 a.m. in the morning and
And of
people were
course,
like,
no one
stop.
knows that. So you're gonna have the one officer that's like, "What? You can't say aloha."
And then he's gonna pull out, and then they pull out
Of
the
course, he's a
exact
nuke. He's
rule.
got the manual in his, he's got the reference
Yeah,
in his
he's got the
pocket. Like,
photographic memory.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like
That's the nuke way, isn't it?
actually here on
Uh,
page. And so, yeah, leadership lessons, we've brought that up a few times, and you talked about kind of the grass is always greener, slash, you understand it's all about, when I was going through the Navy, they always said like perception is everything, that
yeah,
like truth matters, but, perception comes first in the military, especially if your leader sees you doing something that seems like you're not supposed to, right? Of course, they're immediately going to reprimand you and then whatever it may be. And so, talk about being an XO, which could you kind of explain that position for civilians who don't know what that means and like how
sure.
high ranking that is?
Generally, whatever your organization is, the XO is the second in command, usually. And you're going to have a commanding officer and you're going to have an executive officer right under that person whose job is you're not responsible for any one specific department. You're kind of responsible to execute whatever the commanding officer wants. So, in addition to being the second in command, responsible to step up at any moment and kind of interpret what the CO wants or step in his place if you need to. You also have all these administrative duties that basically any administration that is at a command level that needs to be handled by the organization, which in our case, we're in the Navy, so it's a ship. Any administration that needs to be handled at the level of the commanding officer, it all goes through the XO. And so all of the personnel admin, all the medical concerns, all the disciplinary concerns, all that stuff is kind of in your bag of stuff to deal with. So it's a ton of like every piece of paperwork comes through you, but you're also you have this huge piece in kind of setting the tone and communicating to the command kind of the priorities and what you don't get to set the priorities as the XO, that you can certainly influence them, but if the CO wants to go one direction, you want to go another, you go behind a closed door and you say, hey captain, this is what I think we should do, and sometimes you get your way, sometimes you don't, but when you come out, you're in alignment and then you're going to execute, and that's why it's called the executive officer, because you execute the command's direction. It's basically the second in command, So Denzel Washington, and Crimson Tide, and yes, all executive officers are as good looking as Denzel Washington. It's a pretty much a rule.
So, how was your relationship with the captain where you were the XO? Did you have a lot of disagreements? Were you two kind of on the same page? And if you had disagreements, what did you learn or what did you implement to kind of be on the same page?
Yeah, dude, I was so lucky because my CO and I were diametrically opposed in personality type, but we all figured that out and we just happened to get along really well. So those two things, you can have a personality conflict or you can recognize opposite strengths and get along and find a way to make it work. So I was a weapons officer and I was just a very what was it you could say I was a very wepsy weps. I'm just very like I'm into combat, I'm into killing stuff. I want to talk about tactics. I don't want to talk about the plant. you know, and I want to talk about tactics and operations and training and just I've got a lot of personality. I want to interact with the sailors and everything. My CO was like a nuke's nuke, just super nuclear. He just wanted to talk about what the reactor plant manual said. And if we were talking, about tactics or talking about what's going to be for dinner, he wanted to talk about what the reactor plant manual said. And, and that's just the kind of dude he is.
Okay, I get what you're saying.
But we figured out that I was particularly good at delivering certain messages to the crew and communicating, kind of
Mm.
translating if there was something that it was a priority of his, but he was struggling to get it out in a way that would resonate with the crew, I'd say like, "Hey, Captain, I can see that's going to piss people off if we say it the wrong way. Like, I'd like to deliver that message." And he'd be like, "Yeah, you'd be great for that. I'm sure you'll handle that well." You know, I really believed a lot in communicating more than was necessary and making it clear that it was important to communicate everything that I could. Basically, crew, I'm going to tell you everything I know about our schedule that I'm allowed to tell you. And my door's always open. And if you want to just talk about freaking working out or playing video games, like I want to talk to you, like let's talk. And, I will tell you everything I know when I know it, as soon as I can. And making sure that the crew understands that and basically do it and let the English see you do it, as William Wallace says, making sure that they see that it is important to me to communicate to them, that I think makes people feel valued. Their opinions are valued and that makes them feel respected. And I think that was very important.
Yeah, you talk about
So I'm sorry,
communication.
you asked like, how do we handle disagreements? Disagreements, we'd go behind a closed door and I'd say, "Hey, Captain, I think we're going the wrong way on this. I don't think that this is what we should do, or I don't think this should be the priority." And sometimes I'd win and sometimes I'd lose. And after the fact, sometimes it'd turn out that I was right and sometimes it'd turn out that I was wrong. And,
You never
all,
want a nuke to be have the "I told you so" party. They
well, so that's one thing that I never would do, and he
yeah,
would never
yeah,
do either, because
yeah.
I mean, ultimately,
When he loses, you lose, and when you lose, he loses.
yeah,
Ultimately, once you win the
yeah,
fight.
and we learn, but I'm never going to play "I told you so" because he has the right to be wrong, and that's one of the things about whoever's in command has the right to be wrong, and you got to execute, unless it's an unlawful order or violates reactor safety or something like that, you need to execute. And that's just how the organization runs well. And that's what ultimately makes everyone function better and makes them happier. So,
You just gave me my next T-shirt idea: "Walking reactor safety violation." I'm gonna make that a T-shirt. But I gotta say, were you that kind of guy who loved general quarters? You're like, let's do it. Let's run all the drills. Let's like act like we're, under attack. Let's do firefighting and stuff. Like, were you, when you talk about love and tactics and combat and that kind of stuff, did you love like initiating that, like physically doing stuff, like going through the drills?
yeah. So as XO for drills, you have a special role as the CO is going to stay in, and I don't know if carriers are anything like this, but on a submarine, like everyone's a firefighter, and the CO is the one guy who like his job is to go to control and just be in control and make sure the ship's safe
Mm.
from that standpoint. And the XO always goes to the scene. And so fire drills were just became, I got really good at putting on a FFE fast, and going and clomping through with my, like Darth Vader
Yeah.
going, but basically drill days were always hard on me, but they were definitely fun. But the thing about the drill days is like, you don't just say like, "All right, let's go run drills now." Like you got to plan that crap. And it's a lot of work to plan it to do it well, because at least on a submarine, the safety of your ship is if you screw it up, like it can get very dangerous very fast. Like like let's go simulate a torpedo evasion and go fast. And well, you're going to go fast and you're going to start putting on rudders. And when you start putting on, first of all, going fast out of nowhere, like Do I really want to hit flank all the way? And do I want to ring up all head flank cavitate? Like this watch team hasn't stood on a critical reactor in, months,
Mm,
or, I got to think about that. I'm going to go
right.
as fast as I can and put on a hard rudder. Okay. I got to think about my depth control because I can put my ship into a snap roll pretty quickly like that. Like you got to think about it and you got to plan all that stuff out. So you don't just do that stuff willy nilly. But do I love doing drills? Absolutely, I do. Mainly, I love getting effective training out of it. So it's very easy to just run the crew ragged and not really get any effective training out of it. And that always really frustrated me. What frustrated me the most is whenever you don't have your drills planned out well, or you don't react to disruptions to the plan well, and you just have the crew hanging around waiting for the next drill forever and just wasting
Mm,
everyone's time. Everyone's losing
yeah.
sleep. And that drives me crazy. So having all that stuff planned out and then executed well, that's a good day to me. So
Yeah. And I was going back to the communication with the crew, and I really like, how you look at that perspective of making sure that the drills are set up so that the crew's not burnt out, that they're not just dragging that out and around. Like, I think that's really important. And I had Mark Kohler on the show before as a submarine officer as well, and he talked about some submarine sayings, and one of them was like, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like either we all make it to the surface or we all sink or something like that. And one of them was run toward the fire, and
yeah,
he talked about how everyone is firefighting. And then my only good commentary was just that never do your laundry on a submarine. That was all I could say was clean the lint trap. That was my expertise on it.
yeah.
But
Well, talking about wasting people's time like that is a huge morale driver, and it's a
oh yeah.
morale killer.
Mhm.
And you know all about it. And people think about like, well, how do I get good morale in my organization? And they're worried about, oh, well, we need to do command PT and we need to do a command picnic. That's what's going to fix my morale. How about you fix your processes so you don't waste people's time? Have people standing around waiting to start maintenance, or have people waiting in line for an hour to do a tag out to change a light bulb. Like, how about that? What
Yeah.
does that do for your morale? That's the stuff that makes all the difference in the world. Like for me, it's freaking IT. Okay. Like bad IT problems, missing my kids growing up and going through mortal danger, I can deal with all that. But like just bad computers, that's
Oh,
what
that
makes
was
me
the most
more than
frustrating
anything makes me
thing.
want to just flip the table and say, like, all right, I'm done with this. I'm going to go make
Military grade
money.
equipment.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, those are the frustrations.
No,
So
I completely agree. And that was part of general quarters, like when we were running drills, is like you've got one division who has not set their doors to whatever condition, and it's taken them an hour, and every other division did it in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever time. We had a man overboard once, a drill, an hour and a half or like an hour because one division didn't mark that a sailor went home to see a doctor, and we were just waiting on that sailor for like an hour. And especially if it's in the middle of the night, oh my goodness, that is just like you said, instant morale killer. And the amount of times I heard complaints, I'm waiting on someone to sign a piece of paper, especially with medical. People were waiting months for a piece of paper to get signed. People were waiting for PT stuff to get signed for months, for tag outs, for like you said, for a single light bulb, you know. And then what
yeah,
happens is if morale doesn't decline, how do I say it? Like workplace compliance declines where, all right, you know what? I'm just going to change this light bulb. Screw it. I'm not waiting for all this tag out procedure. And then you get caught and then it becomes this huge issue. And it's like the sailor's the issue because I've seen that where people are like, hey, I can change this fuse for you, so and so, but it's going to take me like 3 days on the paperwork because of the rotation of the shift now and the way things are dragging out. Or I can just go ahead and replace this fuse in 5 minutes right now.
yeah,
So it's a balance of not only just morale, but keeping people doing their job the proper way, because when the proper way takes too long, when there's too much quote red tape that takes forever, people are going to try to circumvent it and take shortcuts, you
yep.
know?
And one of the functions of, or just kind of effects of bureaucracies that you will see, and I did a lot of reading on this when I was studying businesses and everything. Whatever the organization is, in the military's it's got its own special conditions, but any organization, more complex than a lemonade stand, as it gets bigger, your percentage of like the amount of people that are actually doing work versus the amount of people that are
Right.
spending time watching the work or making sure that we're doing the work right, that percentage of your overall company effort going into watching the work grows. And if you're not careful, it will consume everything and it'll just drag everything down. And so businesses have all these kind of procedures in place. They have a profit motive. So time is money for them. And so they have all these effects in place to try to drive efficiency and kind of root that out. The military kind of doesn't have that. The military instead has risk aversion. And the Navy is particularly egregious about this because the Navy has the effect where all the procedures are written in shore commands somewhere to be executed by people far away and to keep everything safe and procedurally compliant from a million miles away. And so the procedures are written completely with that in mind, out really, in my mind, sufficient pressure to keep the manpower tax of all of the procedural compliance enforcing mechanisms of all the monitoring and all that you do to kind of keep that under control. So that just becomes a leadership imperative because the procedures are not going to do that for you. And if you just try to follow what you think the priorities are, or you would think the priorities are, based on the way things are written, the whole purpose of ships would be to drive around command monitor programs to far places, training and command monitor programs to deliver them to far places across the world. And so that's just a leadership imperative to keep that stuff under control.
Yeah, for sure. And it can really spiral into something terrible. For example, at least at a shore command or in the shipyards, if we had stuff that could be done by Friday, but because people took too long for whatever reason, and now they say, hey, you got to come in on the weekend and do it now, that's terrible. Or the amount of people who delayed things until Friday afternoon, Thursday evening, and now instead of going home early on Friday, now we got to stay and do this stuff that could have been done 3 days ago. Oh, I mean, that makes that makes people pissed off because the military, at least in the very beginning, as young enlisted, you don't have a lot of free time depending on where you're at. And so anyone taking away any of that free time, I mean, that just, kills morale instantly. And what I will say is, on the contrary, everything you and I are saying just kind of goes against the military saying of hurry up and wait. I mean, the whole motto of the military is hurry up and wait. Ever since I got to boot camp, that was one of the first phrases I heard. And, that's not actually what the Navy puts forward. That's what all the sailors say. It's like hurry up and wait. And
A very old saying, man.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's not just the Navy. That's just the military culture of being ready to execute is going to
yeah,
involve that.
yeah. So I definitely get it. And going back to communication, I really respected and admired the captain on my ship because he
Mhm.
was always transparent with us, told us as much as he could, and he was real with us. Now, what I'm going to share, some people would say was bad leadership. Some men would say it was good leadership. How it works with Stoicism, we'll get into in a little bit, but he cried in front of us multiple times when we had suicides on our ship, when we had a murder, military on military, two members of our ship. He cried. And he had no problem crying when he spoke to us. And the reason I loved him is because he felt like a real human being. And he was the same way. He would sit down with us at lunch. Hey, how you doing? What do you think about the ship and this and stuff? He was personable. Come talk to me. There was still that level of respect. He's the captain. Same with you, right? People can come and talk to you, but still respect me as the XO. But that personableness meant a lot. And he was assigned to a ship that had been going under investigation for a suicide epidemic, three in a single week, multiple in a year, stuck in the shipyards 2 years longer than any other ship. So COVID on top of it, right? He was given basically a failing sinking project. And he was able, I remember every time he gave a speech, it was like my heart started to glow. Like at least I felt that fire inside when he spoke. And so I really admire and respected him as that. Of course, that's hard to maintain, right? If you have the captains doing the best job he can communication wise, but then every chain of command below him isn't upholding what he's promising or saying, obviously it dies out. So that's why it's important that I'm sure you felt this as an XO that everyone underneath you, the command master chief, all the division, COs and all that were in alignment with what you and the captain were doing. So what would you say, what role does stoicism play in military leadership? Like we kind of talked about being cold and iron fisted in a degree of accountability, but in terms of connection and in terms of communication, it's like how real and honest do you get with your sailors? What's the right level to have everyone's respect but not be taken advantage of? Like, how did you balance it all, and how have you seen good leaders in the military balance it?
Well, that's a lot of different questions at once.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you got to be a human, before we even talk about stoicism, like being a good human is kind of the center of it all. And recognizing that there's nothing that is so Socrates made the observation that something is not cannot be honorable that is not expedient, or something cannot be expedient that is not honorable. And of course these are translations, but the basic idea is that what is good is what is right, and what is right is what is good. And that applies at multiple levels, and finding the consistency in things is how you maintain coherency and direction. So recognizing that succeeding in the mission requires positive morale, and you're not going to have positive morale if you're not succeeding in the mission. So those things are
Right.
related. So if you want positive morale, you need to succeed in the mission. And if you want to succeed in the mission, you need to have you need to have morale. And so you need to attend to all of those things. I can't just not worry about my cooks and focus on my engine room. I have to worry about all the things. So that's kind of a little bit of a parallel with philosophy and maintaining the priorities and maintaining morale and leading well. I think that, so you said, okay, what does Stoicism have to do with that? Well, we haven't talked about Stoicism at all. Their entire podcast's dedicated to it, but it'd be worth saying something about what it is. Okay, what it's not is just being emotionless. Okay, so Stoicism is an ancient philosophy from the Hellenistic Greece, the same period that you had the Cynics, the academic skeptics, the Aristotelians, the Platonics, and the Epicureans. You had all these different schools of Athens that kind of popped up after the period of Socrates, but they're, you study some of them in high school and college and stuff like that as kind of the fundamentals of Western philosophy. Well, the reason we still study ancient philosophers is because it's the same reason we still study Shakespeare, is because the stuff that was good about what they had to say cuts to the heart of human existence and will still be good 2000 years from now. Okay, because it is a signal in the noise. It is just something that is always true about being a human being. And they talked about lots of stuff that does not meet that standard, and we don't talk about that.
Mm.
We don't talk about those things. It's the survivorship bias. It's the same reason people say, man, all the classic rock songs were so good. Why does none of the music today is any good? Well, there's plenty of good music today. You're going to be hearing it in 40 years. It's just getting dominated by all the garbage. It turns out that during the period that all those classic rock songs were happening, there was a lot of bad music then too. You don't talk about it anymore because it sucked. you know
Mm.
so
Yeah.
the good stuff is kind of what sticks. That's survivorship bias, and it works, and it applies to ideas about humanity and life. So the Stoics in particular were very much focused on emotional control. And that is why the word stoic kind of has become an adjective that people think means, emotionless. And it can be used that way, as if, say, someone is very stoical, that would mean that they are unemotional, or at least unexpressive of emotions.
It's how
But
social media paints stoicism. At least a lot of the one end of social media, from what I've seen, especially on the male side, the young male side, they really idolize certain characters from fiction and really paint stoicism as this emotionless, I'm going to use some Gen Z words here, Sigma male
yeah,
energy. And I think classic stoicism, philosophical stoicism, and what a lot of the new generations are putting forward are not the same type of stoicism. It may stem off of some ideas from it, but I think that's why like defining the word and when what you're sharing right now is important because people have a very twisted idea of it.
yeah. And, I don't worry too much about, like, there's a lot of distorted silly ideas about Stoicism out there. And, a lot of people who are really into Stoicism will get upset about that, which is not a very Stoic thing to do. you know, I, and the Stoic thing to do is to say, okay, well, people have the wrong idea about things. People don't really understand it. And then you just put out better information. So what I write on is basically, I discovered the actual philosophy of Stoicism through Vice Admiral Stockdale, which is a very important figure in modern naval history. He was just an absolute awesome hero of a prisoner of war situation. Have you ever heard of Stockdale? Does that name ring a bell to you at all?
Maybe I've
I,
heard of
I
him.
guarantee your listeners have not all heard of him. So just to give you just kind of a preview. So basically, he was a fighter pilot that was shot down in North Vietnam and was captured. And he was the air group commander flying missions, and was shot down. And so whenever he landed in that prison system, he was the senior officer there. And so immediately his responsibility was to be the senior officer there, to be in command of that prison colony. And kind of his responsibility was to ensure everyone survived with their honor intact, which was very hard because they were being tortured. Okay. And the North Vietnamese, what their game was to torture you into confessing war crimes and all those things, get on camera and say, my country's war effort is criminal and we should stop. And I beg the government to abandon this war effort. And then they would air that stuff on TV. And it was basically attacking the will to fight at home. Okay. And so without saying anything about whether the war was justified or not, that was a very effective strategy.
Right.
And so Stockdale was just particularly difficult for them to break. They recognized that. And he was just somehow extremely resilient. And what turned out later, and basically after he stayed there for 7 years. He was in that prison camp.
Wow.
Before everyone was released. And he went on and became a vice admiral. He went back into the Navy after 7 years in prison. Like, good grief.
Wow.
And he eventually became the president of the Naval War College as a 3-star admiral. And as the president of the Naval War College, he started teaching philosophy, which, like, what president of a war college is going to go teach philosophy themselves? Well, Stockdale did, because he really believed deeply in the fundamentals of the ideas. And he was particularly vocal about Stoicism. And it turned out that before he had ever gone into that prisoner of war situation, he learned and read a lot of Stoic philosophy and got really into it at a serious level, not the kind of superficial level that you see on Facebook and stuff like that. So the superficial level that I'm now talking about today, that you see bouncing around in kind of internet culture, and the people who fancy themselves as seriously into Stoicism are, have a problem with. I don't think it's a problem. I don't like misinformation, but the only counter to it is to put out better information. So that's
Yeah.
what I try to do. But what I find is that the popular Stoicism, the kind of weak stuff that's just a bunch of motivational quotes, really, that
Yeah. Yeah.
attracts some people to dig further into philosophy. And you find that philosophy itself is extremely valuable. And the reason a lot of young guys are attracted to it is because it's all about being tough and strong and wise and all those things. And what I think is often missed is that is morality. So people don't want to talk about morality. If I go in front of a bunch of dudes and I say, I'm here to talk to you about morals, they're going to roll their eyes and say, like, this is the last thing I want to hear right now, because, they think morals, they're thinking, helping little old ladies across the street and, saving yourself for marriage and all these things that don't sound very tough. They think that those things sound soft. That's from my childhood. No, I want to be tell me how to be brave. Tell me how to be industrious. Tell me how to be a good guy that people want to hang out with, all those things. But those things are morality. And the reason people want to be those things is because they've got it in their heads at some level that that's what a human being is supposed to be. And they're right. It is what a human being is supposed to be. A human being is supposed to be all those things. So the ancient Stoics basically broke down virtue which is being what a human is supposed to be, into four cardinal virtues. And then you see these cardinal virtues taken up and incorporated into Christianity and other kinds of later philosophies. Again, like the Stoics, these guys were around, hundreds of years before Jesus was born. So a lot of their ideas got kind of bounced around and taken up into other things later. But those four cardinal virtues are wisdom, courage, temperance, or moderation, depending on how it's translated, but basically self-control and justice or justness, being a good person, being a just person. And the idea, what makes the cardinal virtues special is that they don't break down into anything else. They don't reduce into anything else. It's kind of like the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, where everything else, every other quality of a good person is some derivative or some mixture combination of those four qualities. And I think that's a very good way to think of it, is those virtues are what a person is supposed to be. And so if you want to be a Mr. Tough Guy, there's a reason you want to be that. It's because you think that's what a man's supposed to be. And it is, but a distorted version of it is thinking that I've got to be a jerk or I've got to go around and put down women or some things like that. And so the kind of worst parts of bro culture and all the red pill stuff that you see that captures a lot of attention, a lot of that, like all the badness of it, just kind of dissolves if you get rid of grievance and victimhood and just whining about how bad I've been treated. And that's what Stoicism, like whenever you actually read past the surface level, is all about, is kind of rejecting any form of victimhood or any form of anyone else being responsible for how I feel. So the Stoics would say, if someone cuts me off in traffic or says something that insults me, all right, now I'm really pissed off. Well, it's not that person that has pissed me off. It is my opinion about what they have said, and I don't necessarily have absolute control over my emotions, but at least recognizing that that emotion is originating within me and my judgment about this event. That is a very powerful disarming mechanism to kind of get control of my emotions. And so that's why Stoics have a reputation for being unemotional, is because they're all about self-control. So does that help?
It does, and I think, for people who aren't understanding why like victimization and self-pity are kind of leading to the bad aspects of some of this red pill culture, based on, a lot of the experts I've had on my show, I would say it's because victimization leads to projection and to projecting stuff onto other people. And yeah, I mean, you look at a lot of bad stuff. Like I've done a lot of sexual assault awareness and stuff like that, and a lot of it is about power more than sex. It's about power and authority, victimization and projection. But you mentioned stoicism being like a means of getting more people attracted to morality in some sense. And so I want to kind of pivot into your book now that you're going to be publishing soon, because you mentioned Stoicism, morality and warfare, a warrior philosophy. So I want to get into all of that because I think a lot of what you just said plays into that.
So basically, what led to writing a lot of it is when Stoicism was blowing up online, and a lot of people were discovering it and finding that it helps them to stay sane in various ways. You immediately have kind of all the things that spring up where everyone wants to draw their battle lines and say, like, well, the real Stoics would think this and the real Stoics wouldn't think
Mm.
that. And I hate that impulse because it's basically taking the negative aspects of religion and glomming it onto somewhere where it doesn't belong. It doesn't belong in religion either. It's just basically immediately naming enemies instead of just presenting the right information. But one of those battle lines that got drawn very quickly is you had the people that say, well, the people who try to apply stoicism to military culture are really abusing they're misinterpreting it, because the Stoics were into a cosmopolitan philosophy of peace. Everyone's, shared members of the universal species. And so the Stoics would not be down with military service. And they're right that the Stoics were believers that everyone is a shared member of a universal species. But a lot of people think that, and yet war is sometimes necessary. And so, kind of what I very quickly detected is what's happening is you had people who are into Stoicism, but they have a certain political alignment. And part of their political alignment is just thinking that everyone in the military is bad and that anything the military might do is necessarily evil, and that all war is, and anything that would be a party to war is some form of murder. And basically, those things aren't very thought through. Okay, those opinions have been said since the beginning of time, but they don't really stand up to very much moral reasoning. But it's just kind of a disposition that some people have. And so when people were saying, okay, well, Stoics would basically agree with me politically, and anyone who disagrees is distorting Stoicism, that's where I kind of had to say, wait a minute. Okay, hold up. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome, and he was pretty much, he wrote everything that he wrote from the battlefield. So
Yeah, I was about to
it,
say.
what, okay, was he just a hypocrite, or are you just imposing your politics on Stoicism? Let's
Mm,
see what they actually said. And so I pulled out my nuclear mentality and I said, what does the book say? And so
right.
that's what my book is, basically me digging into what the ancient Stoics actually said and what their opinions would be about military service. Now, about 80% of the book, 80 or 90% of the book is just breaking down Stoicism. And it's kind of explaining it like a military person. So I'm not going to dumb it down. I refuse to dumb things down. Like that's the way I operate professionally as well. I'm not going to put everything into video game analogies and sports analogies. I'm going to tell it like it is and expect you
Yeah.
to keep up. And so that's the way the book's written. But I'm also going to explain it in plain language. And I find a lot of academic philosophy is just indecipherable, it's unreadable often. And you
Yeah.
know, the academics will say, like, well, that's because it has to be written that way to explain their terms. And sometimes that's true, but more often than not, it's just bad writing. And if you can't explain yourself well, you're just writing poorly and you need to do better, you know? And so
Yeah,
part
say it
of
how
being
it
in the
is.
military is you need to be able to explain yourself well. And so the book's written that way to just explain Stoicism as deeply as we can go without getting into the just indecipherable academic garbage and at a deep but practical level and explaining it thoroughly. And then, kind of in the last chapters, I get into what's called just war theory. And we think about the morality of war from a Stoic perspective and basically get at the question of would a Stoic be a warrior, or would a Stoic think that warriors are inherently evil? And we get at all that.
So it sounds like a lot of historical context. Do you analyze and apply it to any modern day situations or recent wars, or that's it's not really commentary, but more so a guidebook, or like what would you say
So
is the purpose of the book?
yeah, so the well there are a handful of anecdotes that I use to kind of explain the
Okay.
morality of a situation. Like, should I disobey this order to destroy this building that I think has a lot of civilians in it? Or something like that. Like, so I use modern day scenarios to kind of get at those things.
Okay.
There are a few historical examples that I cite, but the kind of the audience that I expect to most gravitate toward are junior officers. But it's not written just for officers. It's just kind of written at that level, academically. But I remember being a young enlisted dude and having a officer stand in front of me and basically have something to say, but then like, well, let me put this in terms that, so you guys can understand it. And then like give me video game analogies and sports analogies. And I just remember
Almost
thinking like,
insulting.
yeah, like, hey, try me, tough guy, you know? And like maybe I don't quite have haven't been to the same classes that you have, but try me. I bet I can keep up. And that's kind of the way I write it. And like there's nothing special about officers, that they just may have had more classes. I went into I came out of, the academy knowing how to do advanced thermodynamics stuff that I didn't necessarily know whenever I was an enlisted guy, but the basic moral concepts of what it means to be a human being, like that stuff's universal. There's nothing special that happened that made me able to understand that because we're talking about stuff that guys were talking about before there was electricity. So, yeah. But I guess my point of that is that the book's not necessarily for everyone. It's not written to be at a simplified level. There are other books for that. It's not Stoicism simplified or easy reading, something you pick up in the airport and just pick up and put down real fast. Like it's kind of deep. It's meant to be a little bit challenging. It's not meant to be hard, but it's meant to be thorough and to actually get at what does the book say and what did they say. And so big surprise, my conclusion is that the Stoics, like most moral philosophers through time, believe that war is justified in some conditions, and that's just war theory. And we can go into that if you like. you know?
Yeah, so my thing is, like you said, it's not Stoicism 101. It's kind of focused on this big question about war. And so, what do you hope the impact will be just that people will have a better understanding of war, and if so, what will that do long term? What's the big picture?
Yeah, no, I mean, don't get me wrong. The war piece, the just war theory, that's just the last chapter. But I think the whole book will help someone fully understand. I think if you read it from beginning to end, you can go from knowing nothing about Stoicism to, knowing more than pretty much anyone you know that's not a college professor. So that was the intent, is like you can read this book and you fully understand this philosophy. And so, what I think that whenever you interact with knowledge, you are altered in some way. So, like, we're not static creatures, we are constantly changing. Every time I eat a hamburger, I'm changed in some way. A profound way of altering me as a human is to teach me something or to learn
Yeah.
something. And so, that incurs a huge responsibility on people who would put ideas into the world. So whenever we interact with an idea, are we altered in a good way or not? So this is moral philosophy. This is ancient philosophy about ideas of right and wrong and how to be an ideal human being as conceived, an ideal man, as conceived by the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. And these ideas, cut to the heart of being a human. I think that you cannot help but be altered in a positive way and be improved by interaction with that kind of knowledge. And so my hope is to basically nudge the culture of the military, young men in particular, military or not, but overall, basically with a focus on the military into a positive direction.
Right, and that's available for pre-order now, coming out pretty soon here at the time of this
Yeah.
episode release. And we're gonna have the link in the description below for that. And then something I do want to ask you, because again, we all have our biases, and also I was at the enlisted level looking up, right? And then you're at the XO level looking down. So all the issues I saw on the ship, I take to people higher up. You're the guy who receives all of them. So what I want to ask is, you were kind of in charge of the overall command climate along with the captain and everyone underneath you. When people came to you with issues, whether they were young enlisted or some of the leaders like chiefs, senior chiefs, master chiefs, what were some of the overlapping main issues that kept getting brought up, or things that really shocked you that every military leader or workplace leader in general should consider in terms of mental health, morale, and kind of like everything going on?
Well, the first thing to know about mental health that I can say in the military is we don't have enough resources for it. And we don't have our arms around it yet. As a leader, you're going to have people who are going to seek treatment that really need treatment. You're going to have people seek treatment that just want to get off the boat and don't want to do
Mhm.
their jobs. And those
100%.
people will piss you off. The thing is, you can't tell the difference. That's the dilemma. And it's not your job to tell the difference. So, kind of like the first thing I'd say to military leaders there at any level, and you're a military leader the moment that you're senior enough to be put in charge of a cleaning detail. So, the thing I would say to military leaders about that particular aspect of mental health is yes, some people will abuse the mental health system. You are not qualified to make that decision. You need to get them to a doctor. If they're seeking treatment, you need to make sure that your job is to get them treatment. And the other piece of that is that these things can coexist. So you might have a guy who is seeking treatment specifically because he wants to get off the boat and doesn't want to do his job. He also very well might need that treatment. It's very likely, in fact, that if a guy is actually having mental struggles and needs treatment, it's very likely that he's going to be trying to get out of work too, because he's fallen apart as a human being. And if you mishandle that, that can be fatal, you know? And so that's something that I never want on my conscience. But it's very frustrating whenever people
Yeah.
quit and you suddenly see everyone else struggling, and everyone else has to pick up that burden. Everyone else has to do the job that that other person did before. So recognizing that, what do you do about that as a leader? Well, what you do is you do everything you can to run an organization and run a culture where people don't want to quit. And that's going to be very hard when the nature of the job is just brutal and it's a meat grinder. And the Navy always is going to be that because it's an industrial environment. It's very hard on human beings. And the resources are always going to get cut. There's always going to be less resources. There's always going to be less manning. There's always going to be less everything than what you need to do your job. And you got to figure out how to make it work. you know, you can get a lot of miles out of not being a jerk and running a culture where not being a jerk is the expectation. And so you identify that and you say that and you say, like, hey, don't be a jerk. And don't necessarily do it for any other reason than you're a good dude, and we just want to be good dudes here. And that's just like, forget how the ship works, forget the mission, forget anything other than just being a good dude because you're a good dude. You'll sleep better at night, and basically cultivating that culture and encouraging it and encouraging other people to be that way, and recognizing that whenever you're run down at the end of the day, you're grumpy, you're frustrated, and then some sailor has some problem or has something negative to report or has screwed something up, you can handle that in a good or bad way. And how you handle that has an outsized impact on that guy's day and that guy's perception. And like, your interaction on that day might just be nothing to you, but it might be how he remembers the Navy for the rest of his life, or it could totally ruin that guy's year.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that it's hard to be sensitive to. So that kind of goes back to, nothing is expedient that's not honorable, and nothing's honorable that is not expedient. Doing the right thing because it's the right thing is good for the mission and is good for morale and is good for all those things. It's all coherent. And that's the idea of having a coherent philosophy, is these effects are mutually reinforcing. They're not counterproductive whenever they're done right.
I agree exactly with what you said about it could be how they remember you as a leader, how they remember the Navy, because I have said many times on this show that chain of command is what will make or break you, because you could be in the worst place in the Navy to be stationed, in my opinion, in a historical opinion, Newport News, you know, and you could have an amazing chain of command and be like, I'm re-enlisting. Like, I love these people I serve with. They are like a family to me. Or you could be somewhere beautiful, let's say Hawaii, because most people think Hawaii is beautiful until they actually live there. And then you're having a great time. It's beautiful sandy beaches. You're on a shore tour. And then your chain of command is so awful that you're like, I don't want to do another day of this. I am getting out. So, you really have a big impact on retention and reenlistment. And like you said, all the mental health issues, because kind of the chicken egg with, is the mental health affecting the job? Is the job affecting the mental health, or both, right? And I don't want to address too much on the, you could call them malingerers, or people who are faking ailments to get out. The nuke program probably has the highest rate of that from what I personally experienced, because like you said, it's not your decision to make, right? But I know people, right, who I've seen it, right, where one nuke is living with five other nukes in a house. They're in prototype or power school or whatever it may be, and they get out for mental health, and then the other five all do the same exact thing. I've seen full groups. I mean, out of my power school class, I was one of only maybe five people who actually made it to the fleet. We lost so many people along the way. When I was going through the program, we had about 1 to 3 suicides a month, or attempts on suicide a month. Like, it was a high dropout rate, high stress rate. But at the same time, like you said, if you assume someone is faking it and then something happens, well, there's that, right? So I think the issue is that, again, the Navy doesn't have the resources to comb through all of these people, to actually sit down, have individualized care and treatment, and actually, spend the time. Because, like I said in a previous episode, if you have hundreds of people on an aircraft carrier, all rushing to medical for mental health. And then you only have three or two head officers who are, licensed in psychology and whatever else is needed for mental health treatment per Navy standards. And then you have hundreds of sailors. You've got, all the schedules going on. So now that lieutenant, whoever it is, can only see each sailor for like 30 minutes. It's hard to have individualized care. So as much as I complain that the Navy doesn't have that, the resources are not there because it's understaffed. You have hundreds of people, right? I mean, most people in the military in general need to talk to someone just because of the lifestyle, because of what people go through. And so many civilians have this misconception that it's like combat zone, combat deployed. That is such a small fraction of the military. The military life itself takes a toll. Now, of course, combat guys and gals definitely have a lot more that they deal with, but just being in the yards or being on deployment is stressful. I mean, you understand it's not just about seeing combat and having combat PTSD. It's about the sleep. It's about the interactions with people. It's about the workload. It's about the stress, the isolation from the outside world, not just on a submarine, but even on a shore tour. The communication can get difficult between you and your family, especially if you're in a rate or a position in the Navy where, or whatever branch where you can't have your phone for extended periods of time, or it's you can't talk about work to people outside of it. So I think people forget that like everyone in the military is dealing with their mental health to a degree just because of the lifestyle. And so I think it is so difficult. And I know they're making changes to push for more third-party resources, to have MFLAGs, to have civilians on board who can see people. But again, you've got one MFLAG for 3,000 people. It's a hard time. And I say 3,000 not because it's under the assumption that, yeah, everyone on the ship may, not everyone is going to need to talk to someone at some point, but a majority of them are going to experience hardship in the service.
Yeah. The thing is, like, all of the psychologists in the world that you can hire will still not meet the demand,
Yeah.
especially if you're just grinding people into the dirt. And especially if you've got a culture where people just sit in their cars and have to psych themselves up to get out of their car and come into work in the day because they're going to be so stressed and they're going to just get beaten and yelled at all day. And so that's where you can make a difference. And you can make a difference as a CO or an XO, or you can make a difference as an LPO or, just a detail lead. Like, just being a bro, being a good dude. That that is where an actual difference an actual human being can make is made. Now, there's an interesting interaction between philosophy, specifically Stoic philosophy, and mental health. That this is worth talking about. So if you go to a psychologist and get therapy, what they're going to put you through is a regimen called cognitive behavioral therapy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy has been around since, 1920s or so. And it's been continuously refined through clinical studies and everything like that. But you've got different methods of psychotherapy. You got the drug-based ones. We're going to give you antidepressants and stuff like that. But cognitive behavioral therapy is the non-drug-based version of this stuff. And often you don't need the drugs, you need therapy. And that's where we'll talk about things. We'll talk about why we think the things that we think. We'll identify the underlying beliefs that lead to certain emotions. We'll learn mitigating techniques to identify the emotions and kind of stop them before we start ruminating on them and get more destructive and interrupt them and interrupt the negative thoughts, interrupt the emotions that ruin us. So a real interesting thing that's kind of undersold in the popular Stoicism movement is that cognitive behavioral therapy was developed by kind of a handful of psychologists in the early 20th century who happened to be deeply read in the Stoics. And their techniques that they developed called cognitive and rational emotive behavioral therapy, the techniques that they use, whether they're emotive imagery or decatastrophizing or all these, they have all these academic terms for them. They're actually just modified versions of techniques that the Stoics taught and the Stoics used. And they're, for a therapist, they're a mitigation, they're a technique. For a ancient Stoic, they're just the way you should think about things as just a pattern of thinking. And so having that philosophical, and that's kind of part of my thesis, is that if you have this kind of philosophical grounding and understanding of how the ancient philosophers would think about things, it's kind of a background routine of therapy that is self therapy. And that's what a therapist will do, is they teach you self therapy. They don't want to have to give you therapy forever. They want to teach you mitigating techniques that you can do yourself and try to, fix your own negative thoughts and your own destructive tendencies. Well, that's what the ancient philosophers did too. And I think that this is largely why popular Stoicism is taking off right now, is because we have a mental health crisis, largely due to the environment that we're in, the disappearance of third spaces and the prevalence of social media and all the stressors that come with that.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of an unnatural environment. And so people are sick, you know, but they're finding here is a way of thinking that naturally inculcates all these psychological techniques that a therapist would otherwise teach me, but they teach them as kind of an automatic behavior, an automatic way of thinking, and that's why they say it helps keep them sane. So it's not just about being a tough guy and being unemotional and being fearless and all those things, although that's a part of it. It's also about not being depressed, and not being overly emotional or not getting too broken up about events of the world and whatever terrible thing is happening in the news that vexes me, and recognizing I have no power over that. It doesn't affect me morally. Therefore, it's irrelevant to who I am as a human being. What my responsibility is in this situation is to do the right thing. I'm not going to get angry at the weather. It's weather. It is, it's beyond my power. That is a very mentally healthy way to think about things. And I think that that's why Stoicism is taken off. So it's not necessarily to say that therapists are doing Stoicism, because therapists are doing therapy. They're doing something that has been refined through experimentation and continuously developed. But what it's more like is that the Stoicism piece of it is like a foundation. It's like a natural cure. Okay. It's kind of like we discovered how to make wine before we discovered a microscope and understood anything about fermentation. We just knew it. We just figured out it worked, or we knew that I could chew on the bark of a willow tree and cure a headache, before I had any idea that what was in that bark was salicylic acid, which I could refine and turn into aspirin. You know, it's a natural thing that just worked and became the way that they do things. And it's a very healthy kind of pattern of thinking to have in the background, and helps people stay sane. So that's definitely something that I want my service members to have in their toolkit if they can.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend everyone would read your book to get a lot more information on it. Like you said, you're trying to put out better information, good information among the midst of all the bad information. And I think to your point of you could have all the psychologists and therapists in the world, but if the environment is bad, you're still going to have all these people coming in. It goes to the idea of prevention over intervention and recovery. If you can have a lot of prevention where people aren't getting to that state, well, then that's better than recovery or intervention, because now you don't have all these people showing up. So I totally agree. And I think you've given us a lot of great advice throughout this episode for both military leaders, regular leaders, and then also just in general. I hope that it's piqued people's curiosity into Stoicism and given them a better understanding if they had a misunderstanding. And I definitely recommend your book. Again, pre-orders are available now and it'll be coming out soon. And then we'll see if you make Stoicism 2 for submariners or something like that. And we'll have you back on. But I want to thank you for your time today and for your service to this country, of course.
Dude, thank you so much for having me aboard.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide. Through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side. As one family we will abide. In the heart of a ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.